She's going to talk about money and meaning in the modern law firm. We've sent the profile, but I'll just read it out. So she is a senior fellow at the Center for Studies of Legal Profession at Georgetown University Law Center and adjunct professional lecturer at the American University School of International Service. She serves as an advisor to law firm leaders on leadership, strategy and governance, and has conducted research on changing role of corporate general counsel, the impact of legal mergers on lawyers' careers, and the cultural climate in law firms. Lisa previously led the case development initiative at Harvard Law School, and prior to that served as a research director and director of executive education at Center for the Study of Legal Professions at Georgetown University Law Center. She holds a PhD from Joint Program in Organizational Behavior and Harvard Business School. So Lisa.
It's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks for coming on a Friday afternoon. I thought I would just give you a little bit more background on me and why I study law firms, because it's good to know there are other people studying lawyers in business schools, but usually people find that kind of odd. So, sorry, this is bothering me. Okay. So I went into business school to get my PhD, wanting to study professional services. And I was really interested in professional services because I just felt like all the things that happen in firms, for professional service firms, your human capital, I mean, your main assets are human capital. And so I wanted to explore that in more detail. And I was really interested in how things like mergers impact people. But I didn't want to do a bunch of case studies on mergers, even though I was at Harvard where, we write lots of case studies. Instead, I started looking around for quantitative data. And I thought maybe I would study banks, or maybe accounting firms, maybe advertising agencies. But then we discovered this amazing data set with lawyers. And there's this thing called Martindale-Hubbell in the United States. And its purpose is now no longer useful because we have the web. But back then we didn't have the web, the internet, and we didn't have websites. So, but the Martindale-Hubbell database basically shows you every law firm in the United States with all the lawyers that reside in that law firm, along with their law school, what year they graduated, what position they are. So I was working with a labor economist at that point who said, this is a dream data set. You just never get this kind of data. And so I had no interest in studying lawyers or the law or anything like that, but there was this really great data. So I have now, for the last, I don't know how many years, been looking at lawyers and law firms. And so it's funny how those things happen. So I ended up writing my dissertation on how mergers impact the career paths of attorneys. And I did over 10 years of data, and I was able to watch lawyers as they progressed up through law firms and across law firms. And then I could watch those law firms merge in the data because I could watch people move from one firm to the next. So it was really cool data. And Ashish Nanda was at Harvard Business School at the time, and he was on my committee. And Ashish has been a dear friend and colleague ever since. And that's why I'm here, even though he's not around today. But I was in India for the first time. This is my first time in India. And he said, you really must come and talk, you give a little talk about your research. So here I am. I am not a regular academic, as I've told some of you. So this is not going to be a traditional academic talk. Okay, so I'm affiliated with Georgetown, but I spend a lot of my time with practitioners. I spend a lot of time consulting and teaching. So with that as a caveat, I want to show you some of the things that we've been seeing in law firms that I think I hope you'll find interesting and maybe thought-provoking. So let me start by giving you some context. I study and I live in the US. I'm in Boston now. I want to teach you a little bit about law firms in the U.S. because I'm assuming that that you probably don't spend a lot of time thinking about them. So in 2008, obviously we had the big economic crisis. This was a watershed event for law firms in the US. And they really went from a time of lots and lots of business. You know, pretty much you just hire lawyers and the business is there and you just do as much as you possibly can, to suddenly the client saying, you know what, we're just going to do this ourselves, or we're not going to pursue that piece of litigation that we might have pursued. The demand just dropped off after the economic crisis. And that impacted law firms pretty severely. It was really quite a shock. And so they did a lot of things right out of the box. So they fired a lot of their associates. There were whole classes of associates that they had already promised jobs to, and they just said, nope, sorry, or don't come, or maybe next year. So, I mean, it was very, very disruptive. They also fired a lot of staff members. And they also made it much harder, and this is still the case, to become a partner in these firms. So it used to be, you know, you'd sort of pay your dues, and not everybody made it to partnership, obviously. But it has now become much, much harder to become a partner in these firms. They've been slower to do this, but they've been shedding equity partners. They've been asking equity partners to leave. Whereas it used to be the equity partnership meant that you basically had tenure and could be there forever. That is no longer the case. If you're not productive, if you're not pulling your weight, the firm may ask you to leave. So, so this has been pretty disruptive. Oh no, what did I do? There. Pretty disruptive, and many people are asking themselves, are we seeing a permanent shift now? Or was this just something, are we going to bounce back at some point? And the longer it's going on, the more it's looking like it's not going back to the way it was. So then the question is, can law firms survive? They've made these tweaks. Can they survive? Can they continue in their current form if this is the new normal, as people like to say? So just to give you a little bit more data on what's going on with the economics of law firms. This comes from Thomson Reuters, and they have this amazing data that comes right out of the time and billing system of the law firms. So they are able to kind of chart demand based on literally the number of hours that are being worked in firms. They have about 120 firms in their sample, and across, most of them are in the AmLaw 200 firms, so they would be among the top 200 firms in the US. And you can see this is 2007. This is growth in demand, and they define demand as the number of hours. And we don't go back much before the economic crisis, but you can see there was a healthy amount here. Then we had the crash in 2009, so we went from positive 4% to negative 8%. And then, it sort of bounced around 0% growth. And really, that's about the industry. It's not growing anymore. This is just showing you billable hours worked per lawyer. This is monthly hours, and again, you can see it goes up and down. It's very seasonal, but it's definitely not where it used to be. And then this is the realization rate. So this is the collection realization against standardized rates. I think this chart is really telling. It's a little hard to read, I realize, but what this is saying is this orange line are the AmLaw 100 firms. The AmLaw 100 are the top 100 firms by revenue in the US. So in first quarter 2007, they were collecting about 92.5%, so 92.5 cents on every dollar that they billed at their standard rates. They would collect the money from their clients. So that amount has gone from 92% to about 81%. So this has a huge impact on law firm economics, right? Because suddenly clients are just refusing to pay the way they used to be. All right. So, given that all this is going on, we wanted to know to what extent are these existential threats? And how have law firms really been adapting to this new environment? And how are they kind of making sense of it? And it's interesting too, because unlike other industries, this is a very protected industry. It's self-regulated. They keep outsiders out. You have to be a lawyer to own a law firm in the US. Is that the case in India too? Do you have to be a lawyer to own a law firm? Can you have outside? I imagine you probably do. Yeah. And by the way, please ask questions. I was thinking we were going to be sitting around a table and just chatting, so I would like to, get a conversation going. But yeah, so we don't have, it's not like you can have like some startup that's funded by venture capital kind of sweep in and change the profession, because they're not allowed to practice law in the US. So, what does this start to look like? So you have these institutional constraints and then the economic environment changing. Yeah. Sorry? Oh, the other lines? These are different segments of the market. So the blue line is the second 100. So those would be the second 100 largest firms. And then this gray line is mid-sized firms. So you can see that the AmLaw 100 are actually hurting the most when it comes to realization. Not so much, but they're all suffering. So the largest firms and sort of the middle market firms.
These firms realize lesser than the mid-size and the smaller firms.
Sorry, can you say
the
that?
Larger firms realize lesser than.
Yes, partly that's because their rates are higher. So clients may, there's more room to come down. So what's interesting, this is another thing that goes against kind of the traditional economic rules, but even as you saw that there's really no growth in the profession, and yet they continue to raise rates every year. So that's part of what's driving this. So it doesn't matter that, usually you get to raise rates when, when demand exceeds supply, right? Then you raise rates. Well, we have the opposite, and yet law firms are still raising rates. But clients aren't paying it. So it's kind of a funny.
Can be reducing employment? That's what it shows, right?
Yeah. Yeah, well, hours worked is going down. Yeah. There are fewer jobs for lawyers now than there used to be. Yes. And some people speculate that it's partly outsourcing that's taking, because while the law firms are sort of bumping along at 0% growth, the outsourcers are growing quite a bit. Okay. So what we've done over a period of about 7 years is we did this very extended interview project where we interviewed over 250 mostly partners. We really dug deep into 6 very large US firms. And in each of those 6, we interviewed anywhere from 26 to 52 partners. And each of these interviews were, at least an hour long, some of them quite a bit longer. And they were very open-ended interviews. And I should mention my colleague that I was working on this with is Mitt Regan, who is a professor, a law professor at Georgetown. So it's been kind of interesting. He has a particular view coming from the lawyer perspective, and I come from the OB sort of sociology perspective. So anyway, they were very open-ended interviews. And actually, before I joined the project, they wanted to study culture in these firms and ethics. And they've quickly decided the ethical part was not that interesting, because they couldn't get people to talk about times when they had broached ethics. Funny, it's funny people won't admit to that. So it kind of evolved into looking at how does culture hold these firms together, and what role does culture play? And from there, what we also realized is that law firms, because these large law firms are so dispersed and many of them have grown through acquisition, that actually you just have a series of subcultures. You don't really have a big overarching culture in the firms anyway. So it's been kind of an interesting study. We've been exploring lots of things, and we've got lots of interview data. But let's talk about where this is going, which is really around compensation. So if we look at that increasing competition on law firms, we find a number of things have happened. So there's this premium on talent. And so they are paying a lot more for lateral hires who are experienced, who can bring a book of business. You're paying more and more to your top people in comparison to your lower people. And that's because those people can still go out and bring in business, and so those people are becoming really, really valuable for firms. And they're emphasizing that entrepreneurship. So they're emphasizing business origination. They're also, as I said before, making more rigorous assessment of partners, and they're becoming just more metrics focused in general. And we have these rankings that are published every year by American Lawyer, that we publish the profits per equity partner every year. So you can kind of see how profitable different firms are very, very easily. That also serves as a recruiting tool. So notice a number of these actually have some element of compensation related to them. So we really started to focus on compensation. Now, in order for me to talk to you about compensation, I need to tell you a little bit about how compensation works in US law firms. Because there's a pretty consistent model that you see. Not every firm works the same way, but there's a fair amount of consistency. And it's a little different from where it works in other parts of the world. So US law firms typically use a very subjective, or I shouldn't say very, they use a subjective approach to compensation that is driven by individual financial performance data, okay? And I'll show you a little bit what that looks like. But the most important thing, and so one of the things that I do in my consulting work is I get hired to come in and help law firms look at their compensation system and review it. As part of that review, I look to see, well, what are you actually rewarding in compensation? And I run models. And originations is always the most important thing driving compensation. And origination here means business generation, bringing new clients into the firm. So that can be 60% of the variance in compensation on that factor alone. These three factors, collections, that means basically, by collections I mean how much production, how much work are you doing, billable hour work, and then money that you're collecting off of your hourly work. So that's collections. And then managing attorney credit, some firms use that. That means I'm managing a client relationship. I've got other lawyers working for me, and I get some credit for that because I'm kind of being a project manager of this relationship. So those three will typically explain 85 to 90% of the variance in compensation. So literally, you put those in a regression model, and you can get 0.9 adjusted R squared. So that's really the bulk of compensation right there. Compensation is also prospective in nature. And what I mean by prospective is that instead of at the end of the year looking at how much money we made and just dividing it up among us, instead we are going to, at the beginning of the year, allocate shares to everybody. And we're going to, so everybody owns a portion of the firm, right? And then you can kind of watch the share price go up as the firm makes more money throughout the year, and then at the end of the year you sort of settle up and distribute all the profits. So those shares are allocated based on last year's performance, but what they're ultimately worth is based on the coming up year. That's why we call it a prospective system. Now, those compensation decisions themselves are made by a compensation committee of partners. And that committee could be 5, 6, 7, 8 partners, typically from around the firm. And, but there's often a number of heavy hitters on that committee. Okay, so they gather all this data and they sit in a room for hours and hours and hours, and they decide on people's unit allocations. So really you have this ability to kind of reward longer term behavior through the unit allocations, and a lot of times they'll look back at maybe 2 or 3 years of performance. They like to go slow up, slow down, they say. But then you can also use bonuses. Many firms use bonuses as well at the end of the year to say, okay, so you had a great year, or you brought in this great client. We don't know if you can continue to do that, but we're going to give you a bonus. And then the other thing is it's very transparent. So if we're all partners together, we all know what each other is making. And we probably know each other's performance data and all of that. So it's right out there for you. And the idea here is that we're partners. We're owners together. And so we should be able to, this is just part of being owners, is knowing what everybody else makes. It causes lots and lots of drama in law firms. Because you can imagine when you have 500 partners, and you can look down that list and say, what's this guy? He's making, so much more than me. That's not right. My clients are so much better. And by the way, I went to a better law school than him. So people sit and make those comparisons, and it's very, very dysfunctional. So that's how the law firm compensation works in a nutshell. So it's very, very different than what you might see in a corporate. Okay. Any questions on that? Because it's kind of crazy. Okay. All right, so just to give you a little bit, this is just some data on compensation systems. So this is just to show you how US and Canada are pretty different. This yellow is lockstep systems of compensation. So that's really dominant in the UK, Europe, Australia, New Zealand. This is a weird study because they have subjective and then they have combination formula, which is really formula plus subjective data on top of it. So in my mind, that's still subjective. So, but this shows you just a few are lockstep. Very few, none of the large firms use a simple formula for compensation. Some of the smaller firms do. So, and then this is showing you transparency and how, it's about 90% of US firms report that partners know the compensation of others. So this is an aspect of compensation I find really kind of fascinating that they do that. And this shows you, I want to give you a sense for the magnitude of how much people are making in the US. It's very good to be a law firm partner in the US. It's grueling. Many of them are very unhappy, but they're rich. So this is in thousands of dollars, and this is divided up by 10 years. So 1 to 5 years. This is this year's data, and then the lighter blue is from 2014. So it's 2016 and 2014. So this is from the 1 to 5 years of partnership tenure. The average is about $450,000 a year. And then it goes up to $1.2 million for 21 plus years, and that's the average. Notice too how it's really growing, and the rich are getting richer. So there's a lot of money being paid out to law firm partners, and clients see this. They see this, and it can make for some awkward conversations, actually. When clients are under budget and law firms are raising their rates, and the partners are making lots of money, and the clients are saying, I can't make my legal budget because you guys are so expensive. So it's quite interesting. Okay, so all of this kind of, it makes me ask a lot of questions, and I don't know if some of these questions might be going through your heads as well. So first of all, one of my first times I interacted with any compensation system was with Ashish Nanda, actually. He and I wrote a case study on a US firm that was looking to change their compensation system. And this blew me away. They figured on their compensation committee, which I think was 7 or 8 people, on average, each of them spent 500 to 800 hours on compensation. Now, I think they did it every other year, but think about how much time and money that is in a professional service firm where time literally is money. It's a huge investment in compensation. And remember, usually like 90% of compensation, 90% of the variance is based on like three inputs, okay? So this is maybe an extreme, but they spend a ton of time on this, really an inordinate amount of time on compensation decisions. And the people that are making those decisions are some of the most profitable, productive people in the firm. So we're going to take the people that are most valuable for the firm, we're going to put them into a room for like a week where they can't be working with clients, they're not doing billable hour work, and we're sitting and we're just talking about all the partners in the firm. So isn't that kind of crazy? I think it's kind of crazy. Then after all that work, what do partners get out of it? They get a number, really. Like, your number is X. Have a good year. Good, nice work. That's it. So many firms are very bad at giving any meaningful feedback along with the compensation. So they've gone through all this work, and they don't even tell them why they get what they get. And then, as I said, they're very slow to react to poor performance. They are reacting, now because they're getting so much pressure from the top performers. But they've been very, very slow to react to the poor performance among partners. They're very quick on poor performance for others, but for partners, they're slow to act. And then the other thing that I find kind of crazy is you look at, in very large firms, they are led by partners. So you have a managing partner who leads the firm, who's part of the partnership, but spends 100% of his time leading the firm. They will not recognize that as this is leadership and we need to treat this person like a leader. Instead, when they figure out their pay, I'm actually doing some research on this right now for a client. When they figure out the pay, they say, what was he making before? Because it's usually a very big book of business guy that's at the top, or a woman, but it's usually a guy. And they basically continue to pay them the same amount. And that's for obvious reasons, because if their pay goes down, nobody's going to want to take that job. But it's just kind of weird to me that you're not even like saying, let's set goals for leadership and let's hold them accountable to those goals, all those things that we do in regular organizations. They don't do it. So there's a lot of strange things about law firms, which is probably why I've studied them for a long time. All right. Oh, why is it doing that? Funny. Okay. So this whole dilemma, I was telling you about how much law firm partners make. That makes a lot of partners feel really uncomfortable. I mean, they want the money, but it makes them feel uncomfortable. And there's this sort of ongoing dilemma in the profession, is that are we a profession or are we a business? And anytime you get, like now when we're starting to get very business focused in the law firms because the market, again, is flat, the same refrain comes up. Are we a profession or are we a business? Aren't we supposed to be a profession? But you're treating us like a business. And observers, bar associations, start to go, oh, this is bad, because if law firms are a business, they're going to make bad decisions and not serve their clients well. But what's funny is that, I won't go through this. Actually, people have been worried about this for the last 100 years. These are just quotes from various people over the years that have voiced something similar in different contexts. So this is a long-going debate. So when we started to look at this, we started to think about compensation and this business profession, quote, dichotomy. And we looked at our data and we thought about what people are saying. And here are some of the things that we've started to think about. So first of all, there are really two functions of compensation, right? So first of all, you have to allocate the profits of the firm. And the way law firms are structured, you have to allocate 100% of the profits. So they literally start over again every year. So they don't keep anything from one year to the next. They do have a capital account, but that's it. So you have to allocate that profit. But then secondly, the process by which they allocate is really how law firms show respect to their people, to their partners. And this is this material economy and the moral economy of compensation. So this is a great quote that I think sums up a lot of, was sort of inspiring to us as we were looking at this. So at the end of the day, the barometer is compensation. It sends incentives, it sends signals, it conveys culture. This is the language we speak, it's the way we know how we're valued. We know everything by how we are compensated, by whatever the metrics are for compensation. So again, takes on a huge amount of meaning for law firm partners. So just to go into this a little bit more. So we've got this material economy, right? And I've talked about most of this already. So we're allocating based on these pretty objective data, although we call it subjective, but at the end of the day, it's pretty objective data. And again, driven by this need to grow, we're gonna reward originations, and because we want to reward people that can go out and bring business into the firm. Okay. And then we've got this transparency and with the rankings that are, people are looking at what other people are making in other firms and making decisions to move from firm to firm, or at least that's kind of what people think. Some people think they're making decisions based on American lawyer rankings. I think it's a little bit more complicated. But it almost approaches a winner-take-all market because you're seeing this bigger and bigger spread. Let me show you, this is a little hard to look at, a little hard to see. But this is an example of just one data point, which is the billable attorney revenue. So this, again, this is for a firm that I worked with recently. And again, this is money that, so if I work an hour and I bill out at $400 and I get paid for that $400, that goes into this amount. Okay, so this is kind of where the partners are. And then this is the compensation for 2016. And first of all, I want to show you that there's one guy that's out here at almost $2.5 million in compensation. But he's like really, really far away from everybody else. And that is very common in a law firm. You might have, this one only has one guy. Sometimes we see maybe 2 or 3, but really never more than that. So you've got a few people that are way outliers, and then you've got a whole bunch of people sort of over here. The other thing I want to point out to you again is this really shows you, this is just, again, one regression on one variable here. Explains 76% of the variance just based on those billable hours in this case. So you've got this huge amount of money that you're giving out to partners, and but there's this uncomfortableness about how much money, you can't just rely on compensation. And there was this huge law firm collapse. If you guys know Dewey and LaBeouf, does that ring a bell to anyone? It was big news in the US. This was a big firm that was very high flying. It flew a little close to the sun and exploded. And one of the reasons why it exploded was that they guaranteed a whole bunch of laterals that they tried to go up in, they were trying to climb the rankings. And so what they did is they lured people into the firm by paying them, guaranteeing them huge amounts of money. And then because it was an open system, other partners said, hey, you're promising that guy $3 million. I want to guarantee too. And then, so their most valuable partners, they had to guarantee them money, and pretty soon there was nothing left for anybody else. And everyone started walking out the door, and the whole thing fell apart. And so this was this cautionary tale that many people would talk about for it happened, what, 2011, maybe 2012, something like that. People were really talking about like, see, that's what happens. You got to be careful. That they were all about compensation. You can't do that. And then you also have this partnership ethos that's really important for law firms. Partners talk a lot about, we are partners, and my partner said this, and in a partnership you do this. So they talk about this a lot. But yeah, compensation is pretty individualistic in nature. And then there's this perception, again, that you need to have these outsized rewards for your most talented people, because otherwise somebody else is going to pay them that much and they're going to leave. So you have to be able to wait, sort of balance this out. And so the way they do that is by this other set of meanings that come with the compensation decision. And the way that they communicate some of these things that I was saying at the beginning of the conundrums are really ways of sort of balancing out this very individualistic, metrics-driven compensation system and making it feel a little bit more collegial, collaborative. So for instance, when committees are spending out hundreds of hours making compensation decisions, they're sending a message to the partners: this is very important. You're very important to us. We are considering this very, very carefully, and this is this is a very important process. So they're sending messages by the time they're spending on that. And the fact that there are these important people on the committee and they're considering my work, again, sort of tells partners, your work is meaningful to us. A lot of times they talk about these values that are important in compensation that you can't really measure, like collaboration and collegiality and stuff like that. So it pays tribute to that because they talk about all these things, even if at the end of the day they don't weight them very much. And so the messages then sort of become this glue, because we ask them in interviews, so how does culture hold firms together? And they're like, no, it's not culture, it's compensation. That's the glue that holds us together. And so they try to send these messages. Again, they don't seem to be very real when you get down to the numbers, but around pro bono work, collegiality, contributions to the firm, community involvement, those kinds of things. So this is another quote that I really love, and I share this a lot with practicing lawyers, and it really resonates with them. It probably resonates with academics too. I think it resonates with kind of knowledge workers, that we suffer from an imposter complex, and we fear that someday we're all going to be found out for the frauds that we are. We're all insecure, we seek validation, and the way we measure our validation is by the way we are compensated. So again, you have a lot of insecure partners, and they're looking for meaning in those compensation numbers. I mentioned earlier that law firms do a very bad job of giving feedback. And this, again, is a firm that I've worked with. And this is so hard to read. This top line is equity partners, and the blue is I receive no feedback. So 40% of equity partners said I received no feedback. And in fact, in that firm, I remember people telling me, I've worked for the firm for 20 years, never once have I ever received any feedback on my performance, even as an associate. So it gets better as you go. These are non-equity partners. These are counsel. So these are progressively sort of younger, lower status people in the firm. But a lot of people in law firms really aren't receiving much feedback. And this is a quote from our research that shows you, as a partner, no one tells you how you're doing or how you're doing compared to other people. So when you get your compensation, you find out. Do you value me? Do you think I'm doing a good job? Crazy, huh? I spend a lot of time talking to law firms about how they need to give more feedback, because I really think that one of the reasons why compensation takes on this outlandish, outsized role is because it's filling a void, a vacuum. They don't get any feedback, and so they put so much weight on compensation. And if they could be a little bit more normal about giving feedback the way you might find in other types of organizations, I think they would be better off. But anyway.
What's the level of satisfaction or the sense of engagement or satisfaction that is there amongst
you mean generally with their compensation or with their jobs?
Yeah, are they happy? So when they say that I won't receive any feedback on the work, nobody tells me about it. Yeah. So I at the end of the day, do they feel satisfied working in the manner they all are working?
No, it's interesting. When we talk to partners, they would say, they seemed pretty happy in their jobs, but we know from survey data that lawyers are very unhappy. Lawyers are very unhappy in survey data. And so I think it depends a little bit. For people that are at the top of their game and doing really well, I think they get a lot of satisfaction from their legal work, but they're not very attached to their firms necessarily, right? Their satisfaction is in their work with their clients, but not so much with the firm.
I guess they would also be very territorial about, their clients, the people who are working with, because so this is my clientele.
Exactly.
This data which you are talking about, is it about partners or is it about
This data right here, this is showing, so this is equity partners. These are non-equity partners, which are really not partners at all because they get a salary. And these are counsel. So it gets better. So this top right is I receive enough feedback and assistance. So by the time you get, yeah, so the lower down you get, firms are getting better about giving associates feedback, and you can see that even as counsel in this firm, they were getting some, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's starting to change, but yeah.
at the partner level, then that may not really happen also, the feedback. Who gives the feedback?
Well, yeah, we're equals,
Exactly.
right? Yeah,
So that is the problem.
yeah,
At the lower level, the feedback is
yeah,
also
it's more hierarchical.
high.
Yeah,
So there is a problem also in who's giving,
yeah.
who can give the feedback.
Exactly. And this is, I remember this woman that said this in our interviews, and she was a new partner. And she was totally like taken aback that, before when I was associate, I kind of knew my place, I kind of knew how I was doing and everything, and then I became a partner and it's like it all disappeared. It's like you're on your own. So yeah, it's pretty interesting. But we'll come back to this idea about the equals. I think that's I wanted to talk about archetypes, and you were mentioning the MVP, yeah. So as we kind of thought about this, we turned to the archetype literature because it seemed to speak to this. So the material economy is really a focus, and I'll explain if you don't know the archetype, this terminology. The MVP is the managed professional business. So that's kind of like we're professionals, but we're going to act like a business, and that's kind of a way of thinking about the firm. The P2 archetype is sort of the traditional professional partnership approach that that we're all equals, and we are friends, and this is kind of how law firms started and many professional service firms started. So that's more simple, yeah.
So in the data which you were looking at, were they MPBs or were they professional partnerships?
Well, I mean, they're not stated. I'll share with you what we thought. Yeah.
It looks like they are MPBs.
Yeah. We think they're both, actually, and we think that that's what compensation is kind of. Yes, they're MPBs, but the compensation is sort of balancing out. So, yes.
So, I'm coming from a case which was written by Harvard Business School. It's called Brainard, Bennis, and Fallon.
Yes, I'm familiar with it. Yeah.
Right? So,
yeah.
there it presents this interesting situation where there's a sort of a split verdict within the firm, and you have the newer generation of lawyers who are more business-driven and the older guards, so to speak, who are more on the P2 archetype.
Yes.
So, I mean, does that also come across in?
Yeah, absolutely. There are people that bemoan this shift. They want things to be the way they were, where everybody just we were all friends and we weren't trying to evaluate each other's performance and everybody respects each other. Those tend to be the oldest lawyers that, came at a different time in the profession. Younger lawyers generally are more on the MPB side. So, but yeah, you definitely, because it's the older lawyers that are actually calling a lot of the shots in the firm. So they're having to kind of make some adjustments. And actually, just in the last few years in the United States, we've seen a big transition of managing partners. There's been like a whole new generation of managing partners coming in. We've had some managing partners who've been in place for like 20 years. And some of those long-time ones have now retired, and we've got young people in. So it'll be interesting to see if we start to see more shifts as that leadership change. It's because it's been really remarkable across so many firms. But yes, you're absolutely right. Absolutely right. So, yes. Okay. So we see these two archetypes. We think they're both happening in firms. So we've got this P2 archetype, which is the traditional values, sharing work, commitment to high quality work, firm citizenship. The impact there is hard to measure, but those are still important to people. And then the MPB archetype, which is the business skills, the measurements of individual productivity, looking at partners, you can develop relationships with clients, and you can measure that, and you can see the impact on success. And so here are some examples of things that we think represent both archetypes, right? So for instance, the fact that we have this, yes, we're making these very business-like decisions, but they're being made by an elected or a compensation committee that is made up of the partnership. So, yes, so it feels like it's us making those decisions, right? They're supposed to be representative and stuff like that. Instead of giving salaries, even though, these firms are managed pretty precisely and stuff and budgeted and everything, yet they're still talking about shares. We are shares. We own the firm together. So we're giving a nod, again, to the P2, I think. This slow up, slow down. So we're not going to raise people's compensation very quickly if they have a really great year. And by the way, if you have a bad year and you're a partner, because we're partners, we care about you. We're not going to lower it very quickly either. And this resistance to paying for management performance, I think, is also there, because we don't want to kind of admit to this hierarchy. And I think the feedback kind of fits in there, too. That feels uncomfortable to us, to give feedback to a peer. But on the other hand, we've been talking about this. We're managing the profits per partner. We're emphasizing origination. 90% of compensation is based on 2 or 3 elements. We're holding partners accountable for business plans. So we're doing a lot of things that look like the MPB. So then there's this concept of sedimentation. So maybe it is a little bit of both, right? So we started with the P2 archetype, and now we're starting to layer on the MPB stuff. But the P2 is still there. It's still really important to people. Maybe less important to the younger folks, but it's still important to the profession, I think. And so that's what this concept of sedimentation is, and we felt like you could really see that happening in compensation. So just to come back, and I think I've touched on most of this, but if we go back to those conundrums and say, okay, so why is it that they spend so many hours? Well, because again, they want to show careful consideration, even when the end result is really quite formulaic, almost. The partners at the higher, the partners on the committee have the highest opportunity cost. They're the biggest billers. And yet, they're the most respected. They're the ones that can allocate respect in the firm. The feedback suggests a hierarchy, right? Slow to react to poor performance. They don't want to seem ruthless in the pursuit of financial goals. That's something that you hear. And why don't they want to allocate resources to leadership? Because again, you don't want to. We're a consensus-driven partnership, but 500, 1,000 partners, you are not, a lot of people in those firms say, we're not a partnership. You can't be. You can't have consensus decision making. So anyway, so you just see a lot of kind of people kind of, on the one hand, but on the other hand. So we really see this playing out in compensation. So we don't think there is this dichotomy between the business and the profession. That you're really incorporating some business principles, but keeping those elements of the professional, the professional identity that are important. And so that, by treating it as a dichotomy is really false, because it's not one or the other. So now, I think that we'll continue along these lines for a while, but until there's like a real external shock to the system. And the only way that's really going to happen, if the economic crisis didn't do it, because that was really dramatic in the US, if that didn't do it, I think it has to be something that really it would be something that is more of a shock than just the environment, something like, a change in the ownership rules. That might shake us out of this sort of sedimentation phase that we're in. But until then, we're not seeing a lot of movement year on year. So that's what I got. Any questions?
I have a question regarding the pro bono post-crisis.
Yeah.
Has the amount of pro bono work taken by law firms has it decreased or has it stayed constant? Or in general, what has the attitude?
Question. I don't know what the data say, but anecdotally, in some ways, firms have done more because they have capacity. They want to keep people busy, so they do that for a while. Because the problem is lawyers are just not as busy as they used to be. But that would be an interesting thing to look at in this context, and I don't know the answer empirically. Sorry, but in theory they could be increasing.
You're talking about outside ownership. What do you mean by that? Is it in the UK, is it changing, or is it?
Yeah. So just in the last few years, the UK has created a new set of regulations for law firms that enable outsiders, non-lawyers, to own law firms. So now we're seeing like the accounting firms can start their own captive law firms. You see firms can and have gone public. Venture capitalists can, so it really is, the UK legal market, we sometimes think US, UK, we're pretty similar. Actually, their legal market looks pretty different right now than the US.
Here in India, for example, the NPO segment is owned, by IT firms.
Right.
It's not owned by law.
Yeah.
So in that sense, there's a change.
Yeah.
And to that extent, I don't know to what extent you call it an MPB, because the ownership is outside, the managers come from outside.
Yeah, it's almost not, the way you were describing it to me earlier, it almost doesn't sound like a professional business. Like it's more of a factory.
It seems that.
A knowledge work or something.
So it's something beyond the MPB.
Yeah.
I have this question that this 2008 recession has affected so badly that the law firms have not been able to recover despite that population has been increasing, overall general awareness, and these are the times when people are fighting for their rights and education level has improved, yet they have not been able to bounce back.
Yeah, so it's what we're seeing is there are some firms that are doing quite well post-recession, and a lot of firms that are really struggling. So whereas the market, I think, used to be a little bit more homogeneous, now we're seeing a much more segmented market where the very good, they are going like gangbusters, but there's a whole bunch of firms that are kind of in the middle that are sort of like, they do everything, they have all these practices, they don't really have any distinguishing features. There's a lot of those firms out there, and they're struggling. So, yeah, it's an interesting times to watch the profession. Other questions?
Is this firms primarily business law firms?
Because
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I should clarify.
And what is impact on other law firms after this 2008 crisis? Let's say if there is what is impact on criminal lawyers, because crime happens and they are going to file suit.
Yeah. You know, no, I don't know of anybody that collects data on those firms because they tend to be very small, and so I'm really not sure about that. All the focus is always on the corporate firms, because those are the ones that are big and they report data. So trying to think if I have anything anecdotally that would suggest either way. And I don't know, because they are really small, so there's just like a huge fragmented market. So, sorry, can't answer that. Anything else? Okay, well, thank you so much for listening so patiently on a Friday afternoon, and it's been fun to be here, and it's a real honor to chat with you guys today. So thank you for being here. Thank you for having me. Okay.